Vidhammer Fantasy.
Welcome back to Vidhammer. In this video, I'm going over another Triumph and Treachery game at Learn to Play Games up in Lutz. This one is a specific scenario from the actual book that has predetermined army lists and deployment rules for the Skaven, Dwarves, and Orcs and Goblins at 3,000 points with 500 points for mercenaries. Here's a breakdown of my list.
So here's what I got. Gonna have Quick Head Taker, nice, good against dwarves, all that good stuff. Gonna have the Grey Seer on a Screaming Bell with 6 Warpstone tokens, I believe, even though this only says 1. I have a Chieftain with the Blade of Corruption and Gambler's Armor. Alright. I've got 2 Warlock Engineers, one with the Warp Energy Condenser and the Foul Pendant. One with the Warplock Pistol, the Shrieking Blade, and the Spell Scroll. That's Robbie. This is all his idea. He wanted to put me in the Hurt Locker. I just... Did you just... No. He just did this. 5 Warplock Jezzails. They're going to be good at blowing up. I got 5 Poison Wind Globadiers. 53 Clan Rats with a Doom Flayer. That's where the Screaming Bell is going to go. 28 Storm Vermin with a Warp Fire Thrower. That's pretty much where Queek's going to go. It's his only option. I got 6 Rat Ogres and a Doom Wheel, Warp Lightning Cannon, and a Plague Claw Catapult. There you go. And I think there's a unit of Giant Rats, but...
Big unit of giant rats, like 13?
Yeah, 13 or 14 giant rats. It might not be on here, I might have already mentioned it, but anyway, there's giant rats. My wonderful mercenary force, Dreadlord on a Black Dragon, and 8 Shades. Actually 9, there's 8 Shades and a Bloodshade. I have to deploy in the very center of the board. The center square, aptly named the Hurt Locker. And then people are going to come at me from both sides. And that's not a euphemism.
3 sides, actually.
How's this going to work? I can figure out where 2 of them are going to go.
Well, the greenskins come from either side of the long board edge.
I think that's what we're ending up with.
I throw my stuff down in the Hurt Locker, and it ends up like this. I run into some problems with how to deploy this Bell unit so I can maneuver it once the other factions have come on the board. I quickly run out of room, so I decide to keep the Rat Ogres and Storm Vermin unit in reserve, since, for this scenario, any units I keep in reserve will come on automatically on my second turn. All the buildings here are actually ruins, so we can move over them. I just don't want the Screaming Bell going over and getting smashed up to dangerous terrain. I try to put my shooting towards the center, but without knowing where the others are going to show up, it doesn't give me any great placements. I roll for my spells and make a mistake, as I thought that both of my Warlock Engineers were level 1s when they're actually level 2s. But it happens. As it is, one of them gets Scorch while the other gets Death Frenzy. I add an extra spell later on once I notice this mistake, and one of my engineers ends up getting Crack's Call. Since I've got most of the stuff I want from Ruin, I have my Grey Seer take 3 spells in Plague and 1 in Ruin. I'd really like to get Plague, Wither, or Blessed with Filth from the Plague spells. And I miss all 3 and end up with Vermintide, Pestilent Breath, Skitterleap, and Dreaded 13th. Steve has some spells of his own this game with his mercenary force. He has a level 4 Battle Wizard with the Lore of Shadow, and gets Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma, Penumbral Pendulum, Enfeebling Foe, and Occam's Mindrazor. For the Orcs and Goblins, Bob has a level 4 with Gift of the Spider God, Itchy Nuisance, Gorkle Fixit, and Curse of the Bad Moon, as well as a level 2 that gets Night Shroud and Vindictive Glare. Bob also gets 70 points of magic items on Golfag, and he ends up with Greedy Fist, the Charmed Shield, and a Potion of Toughness. Bob's deployment is a little different, as Robbie points out.
Okay. Tell me the cool thing.
Orcs and Goblins will deploy from this edge and that edge, from both long edges, with ambushers rule. So they're not going to start there, but they can ambush from turn 1. So, essentially, one unit could start there, or all of them can start on either board edge. Then, from the second turn on, you have the ability to also bring in reserves from either board edge. Steve will deploy from here in an 8-inch deployment zone. So it's essentially going to be a giant clash in the center of the table.
And I'm going to be right in the middle of it.
You're going to be sandwiched. Sweet lovin'.
Steve, on the other hand, has to put all his stuff on the lower short table edge. He goes for some slayers on the right, some warriors and longbeards to the left, along with some hammerers that are off-screen. The iron drakes are proxies for quarrelers in the center, and he puts his 2 Empire mercenary units to the far left, being a unit of spearmen with his battle wizard and some free company militia. He also has a unit of miners that come on as ambushers later on. With our setup complete, we start everything off and I pull the first turn. At least it makes the decisions relatively easy since I've only got 1 target on the board right now. Steve's units are too far away for a charge attempt, so I have my Doom Wheel skirt the outside of the buildings. In retrospect, I should have moved it the other way and just bit the bullet for dangerous terrain. Otherwise, though, I just try to move things around a bit to be ready for the next round and get some of the units out of the center so I have a little more room to move. My first magic phase ends up 10 versus 7. I make an initial ring of the Screaming Bell, and it moves forward a few inches before I use 4 dice for Scorch on his Iron Breakers that have his general in it. I do a couple of wounds, then I use 6 dice for Dreaded 13th, and I roll high enough for it to go off, but I don't get Irresistible Force, and he dispels this with his rune. With the power dice used up, I try for some shooting and fire my Plague Claw catapult at his huntsmen, hoping to panic them off the board. And in true Vidhammer fashion, I roll a misfire and it blows up. The Doom Wheel restrains from frying the clan rats, then the Jezzails fire into the huntsmen, hoping to thin the ranks. The Warp Lightning Cannon puts a shot into the Slayers, but it sticks in the ground for no effect, but the Shades follow up for a single wound. Now it's over to Steve, and he's also unburdened by decision. He has the Huntsman charge the Warp Lightning Cannon, but fortunately he biffs the distance. But he evens out his statistics, rolling an 11 to make his charge into the Doom Wheel. Everyone else pretty much just closes in and generally has a good time. Steve's magic is 10 versus 6. He uses 5 for Penumbral Pendulum into the Lightning Cannon. And I know he's got several other nasty spells he can cast, and it's also a bit of a longer shot, so I let it go, and it does go far enough to hit the cannon, but it only scores a single wound. He uses his last 5 for Occam's Mind Razor on the Longbeards that are in combat with the Doom Wheel, and I roll all my dice and get an Irresistible Dispel. For shooting, the Quarrelers manage to kill off 3 clan rats from my big block. Then in combat, the Doom Wheel manages to cause 3 wounds to the Longbeards before it's smashed to bits and he overruns into the Screaming Bell unit. Now it's Bob's turn, and he's got a lot of stuff he wants to bring to the party. He starts with a big unit of 40 Night Goblins with Skarsnik, followed by his mercenary force of Man-Eaters near the center right. Then there's a Mangler Squig, a Squig Herd, and some Squig Hoppers that go down in the lower right to threaten the Slayers, while his Boar Boys with his BSB go in the upper right. For the left side, he puts an Archer unit towards the top with an Arachnarok Spider, but still has some Savage Orcs, Trolls, and more Night Goblins that don't make it on the board yet. For magic, Bob targets me, and it's 5 versus 4. He uses all 5 for Skarsnik's Prodder spell on my Shades, and I'm unable to dispel it since I roll like this. I lose some guys, but at least they pass the panic check. Then it's time to shoot, and my giant rats lose both of their packmasters to the archers, and the spider launches its flinger on the Shades, but it drifts off. Steve gets to start the second turn, and has the Huntsman charge into the Warp Lightning Cannon, and they make it this time. The Slayers, however, are unable to join in on the Bell combat. It doesn't stop him from moving all the other stuff up though, and all I can say is that it's getting real in here. Steve goes after me for magic and ends up 10 versus 6. He rolls the first 2 for Melkoth's Miasma on the Screaming Bell unit, and he rolled an 11, so I end up spending 3 of my dice to dispel it, since it would guarantee that I would need 5s to hit him. The next 4 go for Enfeebling Foe on my Bell Rats, but I'm able to get an Irresistible Dispel with the last of my dice. His final spell is Occam's Mind Razor, but he doesn't get Irresistible, so I go ahead and dispel this one with my scroll. I'm the target again for shooting, and the first gyrocopter steams the Jezzails for 1 wound, while the second goes into the Shades for 2, forcing a panic test that they fail, causing them to run through the Poison Wind mortars, but at least they hold. In combat, the Warp Lightning Cannon only takes a single wound, but it passes its break test, which is lucky since I notice at this point that the Chieftain that I have in the Bell unit is not a BSB. The Goblins and Dwarfs get a BSB, but not me. It's not too big of a loss then when he dies in the Bell combat along with one of my Warlock Engineers. I lose the combat, but with the Unbreakable Bell, they're still around for a while. Bob gets the next go and targets Steve for movement, so he can charge his Squig herd into the Slayer's flank. The Mangler Squig also goes through the Slayers and scores some wounds. Another unit of Night Goblins comes down in the lower right and releases some Fanatics into his Quarrelers. He goes against me with magic and ends up with 6 versus 4 and uses all 6 for Skarsnik's Prodder on my Shades to get the kill and rack up a few coins. In shooting, the archers fire into the giant rats again, and with a treachery card to let them reroll misses, he takes the unit down to only 3 rats left. Then for combat, Bob targets Steve, so I become neutral, and Steve's units and mine declare a truce. This pushes our Screaming Bell combat apart, so there's one less thing for me to worry about. For the actual fighting though, Bob's Squig herd is able to take out 11 Slayers, but the bad thing about Slayers is when you kill them, they get to make a final attack on you. So they were still able to kill off about 7 or 8 Squigs and a few Goblins despite being flanked. As a result, Steve is able to reform amid defeat and face the Squigs, but we don't bother spinning the models around right now. On my turn, I try to charge the dragon into his huntsman, but he buys the poor thing off, so no glory for me there. I also go for the Hell Pit into his gyrocopter, but Sweet Lovin' isn't up to steam quite yet. Then I bring on the Storm Vermin with Queek Head Taker and the Warp Fire Thrower to the lower left, and put my Rat Ogres behind Bob's Night Goblins in the upper right. I reform the Bell unit to offer less targets, and move up the Poison Wind Globadiers towards the center to shoot the gyrocopter. In my magic phase, I ring the bell with 3 dice and end up getting Deafening Peals, so everything on the board with a toughness of 7 or more takes wounds, and I kill my own Warp Lightning Cannon. Then for the actual magic, I use 3 dice for Pestilent Breath on the Longbeards, and even though I end up hitting 14, I only score a single wound that he saves. Then I go for Crack's Call and get Irresistible Force, but it has to be in the forward arc, so it's only able to kill off 2 before I lose my last die and take a wound in the backlash. That doesn't stop me though, because I eat all 6 of my Warpstone tokens and go for Dreaded 13th, but I roll a couple of 1s, so he was able to dispel it, and I took a wound as well. For shooting, I have the dragon shoot his template into the huntsman for 4 wounds, but they pass their panic test. The Jezzails reformed so they can't shoot, but the Globadiers lob into the gyrocopter for 1 wound, and with no combat for me this round, we head into the next turn. Steve tries to target me, and I play a treachery card that I've been saving for this. It costs me a copper coin, but it makes Steve choose a different target. So he has to target Bob, which keeps my Screaming Bell alive a little longer. Steve has the Slayers charge into the Squig herd, and Robbie decides to help out by actually turning the unit around at this point. Always helpful, that guy. His other units move around, with one of his gyrocopters making a flyover of Bob's squig hoppers and drops bombs for 2 wounds. Magic is 5 versus 4 as Steve targets me. I don't have any cards or a Dispel Scroll to stop his fun, so he throws all 5 dice for Occam's Mind Razor on his unit. But I do play a Treachery card where I discard 1 copper coin and choose the target for the spell. So I choose my Screaming Bell unit, and his caster takes a wound in the backlash. Naturally, Steve picks me as his target for shooting, and Bob plays a Treachery card that lets him shoot with one of his units, and he has the archers fire at my remaining giant rats and takes them down to a single model, but it still passes the break test. For Steve's shooting, he has the gyrocopter steam through my globadiers and kill off 1 of them and 7 of the close-by clan rats. Then in combat, the Slayers manage to take the Squig Herd pack down to a single squig before it explodes and kills off another Slayer. Bob gets the next round for his Goblins. He has the Savage Orcs charge into the lower left warrior unit. I think they're Hammerers, but they aren't. They're just warriors with hand weapon and shields. But I don't know, they all look alike to me anyways. One of his fanatics cuts through the Quarrelers for a single wound before 2 of the others touch each other and get removed for harassment. Next, the Mangler Squig tries to get a piece of Sweet Lovin', but I'm neutral right now, so they just rub against each other, much to his delight. The Trolls come on the board though, so there's a little more to think about as the Man-Eaters move up some more. But thankfully the Boar Riders fail their animosity for the second time, so they still aren't much to worry about. Bob targets Steve for magic, and I'm just glad I'm out for this one. It's 6 versus 4, and he uses his first 3 for Skarsnik's prod on something, but apparently Steve didn't want to get prodded by Bob because he rolls 4 dice to dispel it. Bob uses his last 3 for Vindictive Glare on Steve's Slayer unit, and takes it down to 3 models. I'm sure Bob is looking for some points here in the shooting phase, as he has his archers shoot for that lone giant rat, but he rolls like me, and the silly thing lives for another round. Just out of spite, Bob has the spiders shoot my clan rats with its web attack, and makes them always strikes last. In the Savage Orc combat, the Orcs are able to kill off 4 warriors, but they lose 5 in return, and the combat ends up a complete push with musicians on both sides. Then in the lower right, Bob's Squig Hoppers manage to wound with all 5 of his attacks, but Steve rolls 3 6s for the saves and stays alive, only to fail the break test and flee off the board. Now it's my turn. Since Steve was nice enough to buff my clan rats for me, I go ahead and charge them into combat. Just to give me more room, I charge the Warp Grinder to the Quarrelers as well, but they're not quite able to make it. I also make an attempt to charge that awesome dragon again into Steve's Huntsman, but he buys them off again. I am able to get Sweet Lovin' into the Slayers though, and at least that combat's looking good. Magic for me is 9 versus 5 as I go after Steve again. I used 3 dice to ring the bell and rolled a 13, which lets all of the models in this unit attack this round as if they were in base contact with the enemy. This is the point where I really like the Screaming Bell. I had to take a couple of wounds because I rolled doubles, but I do get to do damage to all of Steve's units within 12 inches. But I didn't roll very well on that and only ended up doing a couple to a few of his units. Nothing important though. For actual spells, I used the first 4 dice for Vermintide into the combat, but I only end up doing 1 wound. The last 5 I use for a Hail Mary of the Dreaded 13th on the Quarrelers, and get Irresistible. It doesn't wipe out the unit, only does 10 wounds before the backlash takes out 5 clan rats and tries to put one on the Grey Seer, but he saves this one. For shooting, I have a wonderful shot lined up for my Warp Fire Thrower, but Steve plays a Treachery card that makes my unit count as though it had moved, so it doesn't get to fire. The Globadiers lob into the Gyrocopter but fail to wound. Then the Jezzails fire at the Huntsman for 2 wounds. But the Huntsmen pass their panic test, which doesn't bode well for the Jezzails. Then in combat, Sweet Lovin' has his way with the Slayers, but they are able to do a wound in their death blows. For the central combat, a few Treachery cards come down for Steve as he tries to even the score. Most notably, one that makes both of us have to re-roll our successful hits. Not so bad for him since he has the hatred though. Despite the buffs, the bell gets some impact hits and the amped up mind-razored clan rats do enough wounds for me to win the combat by 9, despite taking a few wounds on the bell. It doesn't matter to him though, since he uses his lovely rune that lets him take a leadership test on a single die for 1 round. He rolls a 1, and actually rolls it twice since his army actually has a BSB. The outcome's a little rough, but if I can manage to go before Steve in the 4th turn, then the Mind Razor will still be active, and maybe I can get another chance at this. Of course, Steve gets to go first in the 4th turn, and it's important to note at this point that Robbie has been offering up bonus coins to whoever can guess correctly what person's card he's going to flip over for the first player. Steve guessed himself in the 3rd turn and got a silver coin out of the deal. This time around, there's a gold coin on the line, and Steve and Bob both choose Bob, and I choose myself. Robbie turns over Steve's card, so no one gets anything this time. The huntsmen that are hidden behind the lower left ruin charge my Jezzails. Free Company militia declare a charge around the Savage Orcs and into my warp fire thrower, but I have it flee, hoping for a short flee distance, and maybe it can stop before the board edge, but it would have none of that. Fortunately though, Steve's Ironbreakers pack up the charge fail banner as he rolls a 3, when all he needed was a 4 to get them into the Screaming Bell. In Magic, it's 4 versus 3 as Steve targets Bob, but he still uses all 4 of his dice for Occam's Mind Razor on his Longbeards, but it doesn't go off. Which is nice, because I'm sure Bob wouldn't have dispelled this one even if he could. For Steve's shooting, he has the Quarrelers fire into Sweet Lovin' for 2 wounds, as the Gyrocopter steams my Globadiers, but just ends up making their hair look really nice. Now in combat, the Jezzails lose and run, but I burn a coin and play a treachery card that cuts his pursuit distance in half, so at least there's no points lost yet. It does force a panic test in my Globadiers though, and they fail this one and run like a sack of bitches. For the big combat, he plays the treachery card that gives him +1 weapon skill. Then in attacks, the Rat Ogre on the bell manages a single wound, and the rats score 2 more. I take a few wounds in return, but with the ranks I end up winning the combat by 4. Steve plays another treachery card to give him +1 to combat res, so he's only down by 3. So now, he just has to roll a 7, with the reroll. But he fails them both, and I collect some points for the BSB, but even though the unit standard bearer dies, he has a single model left that gets away. Well, yeah. Next up is Bob, because I like going last. He has some more tough luck on the Boar Boys as they fail their animosity yet again, but he makes up for it with his Man-Eaters making the charge into the Screaming Bell, taking a wound to dangerous terrain in the process. For some reason, I was thinking that his Trolls were his mercenary unit. Why, I'm not really sure. I blame Gyrocopters because they're overpowered, but your personal results may vary. The Giant Spider charges the Jezzails, who flee for their lives. Archers move up and release Fanatics at the Lone Rat, and manage to kill the poor bastard off this time. The Trolls fail stupidity and stumble forward as Skarksnick's Night Goblins fail to charge on the Globadiers. I get targeted for magic again, and it's 8 versus 6 for Bob. He uses 5 dice and a magic mushroom for a Gorkle Fix-It on my Screaming Bell unit to make them re-roll 6s, and he gets Irresistible Force. He loses the spell in the backlash and the rest of his power dice, but the spell will stay until his next turn. His shooting makes good with the archers killing off the final huntsman, and the spider tries to take out Steve's lone Longbeard, but misfires. Then in combat, 2 clan rats die to impact hits, and about 13 more in normal attacks and stomps. I lose combat by a landslide, but as long as that Screaming Bell's still alive, I'm unbreakable. For my turn, all I really want to do is kill off that lone Longbeard. I try to get my dragon to charge it, but apparently it isn't actually my dragon. It's Steve's dragon, since he buys the flipping thing off again, so I can't do squat with it. but I am able to charge Queek's Stormvermin unit into his lower left unit of warriors. The Warp Grinder tries to get out of the way by charging into the Quarrelers, but fails the distance. Fortunately, the Hell Pit manages to pull it off. And by it, I mean his pants. The Jezzails manage to rally, and over into Magic, it's 8 versus 4 as I go after Steve, hoping to get some Crackskull into his lone Longbeard, but first I ring the bell with 3 dice and I roll a 13 again, and this time it manages to kill off a few more models. Most importantly, the lone Longbeard, getting me some much needed coins. I even get some bonus coins when I land Scorch on the Free Company and manage to make them flee off the board. I don't have any shooting this round, but in combat, Queek has to issue a challenge and ends up scoring some wounds in Overkill along with 4 from the Stormvermin, and even though 6 of them end up dead, I still win the combat by 3 and he sticks the break test, but he does fail to reform. Finally, Sweet Lovin' flails his fists and he manages to roll a 1 for his impact hits and Thunderstomp, so I end up doing just enough to let him stick his break test, as I proclaim that Quarrelers are too overpowered. Not really, it's my dice that are underpowered, we all know that. Once again, for the 5th turn, Robbie offers up bonus coins, this time 2 gold coins, and Steve guesses himself, and wins again. The Screaming Bell is the ultimate target, so Steve charges in with his Iron Breakers as the Spearmen actually try a charge on the Dragon, but they fail the distance. Otherwise, things move a bit, but nothing of real consequence. This magic phase, Steve gets 11 power dice against my 6, so I discard 2 coins and play Duplicitous Mage that prevents his only caster from being able to cast spells this phase. Steve targets Bob for shooting and has his gyrocopter steam into the archers for 11 wounds, and they fail to panic, but only run 4 inches and don't make it off the board. Now in combat, we do the lower left one first, as Queek manages to do 5 wounds by himself, and the Stormvermin follow with 3 more. He loses combat by enough to need Snake Eyes, but once again I fail to catch them when they flee. In the big combat, my glorious Rats and Bell manage to do absolutely nothing this time. I lose several clan rats in return and take a bunch of wounds on the Screaming Bell, but I'm able to save enough so that it has a single wound left. I get the next turn, and I'm ecstatic not to be last finally. I declare Steve as my target even though I'll lose the Screaming Bell. I'm hoping I can catch the fleeing warriors and get the points. But Steve plays a treachery card, so I have to target Bob instead. So I have the Rat Ogres charge the giant spider, but Bob plays Caltrops on them, so they fail the distance. I'm able to get the Stormvermin and the Hell Pit to flank both sides of his lower Night Goblins, and the Dragon even goes for a crazy charge on the Savage Orcs as well. And for some reason, Steve just doesn't buy this one off. I have no idea why. For Magic, I don't have any casters left, but I do ring the bell. Unfortunately, I roll a 12, and it has no effect at this point. Shooting-wise, I have the Globadiers lob into combat, and I only end up hurting myself. Good job, guys. As we start our combat, and it's getting a little late, Bob just picks up his unit rather than bothering with all the attacks. He does roll for Insane Courage and the fleeing distance, though, but the Hell Pit ends up catching them. For the Dragon combat, Bob actually declares a challenge, and even though he loses and his character dies, the Dragon doesn't get to attack or Thunderstomp, so we end up tied in the combat. And since I don't have a musician, I actually take the break test, but he passes. As Bob finishes off our game, the Boar Riders once again fail Animosity check, but the Man-Eaters are able to charge into the Screaming Bell, and that's just stuck between a rock and a hard-on. The Archers aren't able to rally and run off the board, leaving their coins to Steve and their will. There's some magic, but I didn't make a note of what it was, but what's really important is the combat. The Man-Eaters are able to kill off the Screaming Bell and a bunch of rats who are no longer unbreakable, and they get cut down when they flee. Bob rakes in enough coins to bring him and I to a tie for first place. But he's also got a treachery card that gives him 2 extra coins for beating the person on his left. And that's how it ends. Bob gets the victory for the Goblins. I don't feel bad at all, considering where I started up at, even though my dragon ended up going home with Steve at the end of the night.
Okay, everybody, that was our second Triumph and Treachery game. Big hats off to Robbie for suggesting it and putting that one together. Thank you, sir. That was great. It was down to the wire. It was a lot of fun, and we had a slew of models on this table.
And
the entire store was gathered around watching what was going on. It was a blast. Hope you guys enjoyed it.
We did.
Any final thoughts on that one as far as craziness? Yes, I need the fell blade. I need the foul blade. And I'll have to bleep that one out too.
Yep.
But that was fun. What were the pivotal moments in that one?
Well, obviously the big combat in the middle.
Yeah.
I enjoyed being sandwiched between both.
Paul and Oreo.
And Oreo, definitely. You were the cream center.
You were the cream. The dragon being purchased was also a big.
Yeah, it wasn't my dragon. Until the very end, I finally got to do something with the game because Steve actually wanted to hold on to his coins.
You know what I mean? And then like
that dragon's still not my dragon. It's just not. It'll never be my dragon.
It won't.
But hope you all enjoyed it, and we will see you next time, guys. Keep fighting.
Nice.